Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the UBS Center for Economics and Society, I would like to welcome you to today's lecture, and a warm welcome too to those who are joining us from home via live stream. My name is Joachim Voth. I'm a professor of economics here at the University of Zurich, and I'm also serving as the scientific director of the UBS Center at the Department of Economics. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous book with the title, The End of History. And what he meant was not that time would no longer lapse, but that only one model of society and of economics had triumphed, and that this triumph was final. And of course, he meant the triumph of Western democracy. Now, it's probably fair to say that this verdict has not aged well. And especially in recent years, we've seen that this trend towards more democracy and also greater beliefs in the superiority of capitalism has gone into reverse, that there's ever more dictatorships ably asserting their grip on power. And the Ukrainian war today confronts us with some of the ugliest consequences of authoritarianism. So many are rightly wondering, what went wrong? Where does the sudden resurgence of dictators come from, and where do we go from here? Now, it is my great honor to welcome Sergei Guriev, who is not just one of the foremost experts on the Russian regime and economy, but has also thought deeply about dictatorships. He's a professor of economics and pro-rector of the University Sciences Po in Paris. He's a former chief economist and member of the executive committee of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and has worked in political economy, on labor mobility, on corporate governance and contract theory, publishing in a wide variety of leading international journals. He has also served as a board member of several Russian banks and companies, as well as on international scientific councils and committees. And he is a research fellow and head of the Research and Policy Network on Populism at the CEPR in London. Recently, Sergei, together with Daniel Treisman, published a book called Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century, which just came out in April of this year. And it's probably correct to say that it's sadly up to date. They describe the rise of an authoritarian model that's been spreading around the world in recent years. We're all familiar with the brutal and often ideologically motivated dictatorships of the early 20th century associated with the names of Hitler and Stalin. In their book, Sergei and Daniel use data, analysis, and historical detail to argue that the prevailing model of dictatorships has changed to one in which dictators no longer need to use mass repression and instead pretend to be democratic, using the same tricks of the trade and propaganda as spin doctors in democracy to generate public approval. Now, before I hand the floor to Sergei, let me just briefly mention some technical information. During the presentation, you can submit questions online. So if you would like to do that, use your mobile phone, open a tab in a browser, go to menti.com, that's menti.com, and use the code 1925 5422. 1925 5422. And then you can just type in your questions for the live Q&A. We can't take all the questions, but we'll select the ones that have received the most thumbs up. And with that, let me welcome Sergei. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for these generous words of introduction. I'm actually using Menti when I teach. I'm very happy that you're using this application. It's really nice. I was trying to decode these dates, 1925 to 5422. Maybe this is the current wave of democratization we are living in, which will achieve 100% of democracies in the world by the year 5422. But I use Menti, and I know these are randomly generated numbers, so don't get me wrong on that. And thank you very much, Joachim, for referring to Francis Fukuyama, because this is actually something very much relevant to our book. And I'll talk about this. And also Frank wrote a praise for the back page of our book. So what I'm going to talk about today is indeed the line of research we've developed with Daniel Treisman, who is a political scientist from University of California in Los Angeles. We've written a number of scientific papers, but this book, Spin Dictators, the Changing Face of History, of Tyranny, in the 21st century, this is a book for general audience. It is accompanied by the website spindictators.com, where we put all the data, replication codes, so you can actually generate all pictures and tables that we refer to, and pictures and tables themselves as well. So the book itself has 2 or 3 figures and 2 or 3 tables, but tens of figures and tables are on this website. So while we are talking, we are trying to use lay language, and we try to discuss those issues which we think should be discussed with general public. It is based on research published in refereed journals. So let me first and foremost show you the image of dictators in the previous century. So if you look at these guys, Joachim already mentioned some of these names, you see that these are the guys who indeed relied on mass repression and ideology. And this is something that the word dictator is synonymous with. So if you ask somebody what a dictatorship is, they will talk to you about brutality, fear, terror, and often grand ideologies such as communism or Nazism. Now, today's non-democratic leaders are different, and here are just a few of those faces. We discuss almost all of them in our book in detail. Our book is actually based on number of profiles, so each chapter talks about one specific tool in the toolkit of a spin dictator and illustrates it with one of those personalities, some others which are not on this slide. We believe that Lee Kuan Yew was a pioneer, Fujimori another pioneer of the model, but most of these guys are ruling their countries in the 21st century. Chavez, yet another guy, Orbán, and Putin 1.0. It will be clear why we need 1.0 versus 2.0. Now, these guys even look differently. These guys don't wear military uniform, right? So they travel to Davos, they travel to Paradeplatz, they talk to counterparts saying, we are Democrats, we are popular. And even though Chavez was an officer, he actually did wear civilian suits. And vice versa. On the previous slide, when I showed you a number of guys who were not generals in real life before becoming dictators, they would wear military or paramilitary uniform because this is what is synonymous with fear. And their model was to project fear. Now, the current generation of non-democratic leaders are non-democratic leaders. Don't get me wrong. Now, those of you who do research in political science know that, for example, political science is divided whether Orbán is a Democrat or not. There are some measures of democracy, such as polity, which still give him a perfect score on democracy, 10 out of 10. And of course, there are some others like VDEM, which believe that Hungary has already been a non-democracy for a few years. But there is no doubt about others. So the goal of those guys is not to hold free and fair elections and be subject to accountability of democratic procedures. Their goal is to be in power. And yet, their methodology, their toolkit is different. So their idea is to use less violence exactly to pretend to be Democrats, exactly in order to be part of the global society of rulers and investors. And for that, of course, they need to use less violence and use it in a deniable way. Now, they also don't really have an ideology. A lot of people would say, well, Orbán and Putin have conservative ideology. That's not really an ideology once you compare it to Nazism and communism, and also not very different from some ideologies you can find in center-right parties in Europe. So it's not really how 20th century ideologies worked out. And what is more important, they pretend to be Democrat. So when you ask them, are you non-democratic leaders, they would say, we are a democracy, we're just a different democracy, but we are the real democracy and yours is a fake democracy. And now, interestingly, if you look at poll numbers, and that's very important that I'm talking now about Putin 1.0, not Putin 2.0. But when you look to pre-war Putin, you could actually look at the poll numbers, interpret them meaningfully, and learn from that. And these numbers would actually show you that some of these people had popular support, which was substantial. And Dan Treisman and I wrote a paper studying data on popularity of authoritarian leaders. And we showed that, indeed, these numbers give you something. We also studied research on list experiments, and if I have time, I will talk about that, which shows how to distinguish the true popularity from what we call experimental demand effect, when people don't want to say things that may upset the government or the pollster. So our argument, as Joachim rightly mentioned, is not that everybody now is a soft dictator. No. What we are saying is there is a new toolkit. Some old-style guys remain, but they're just fewer. And that's exactly the point of the book. We collect data on different regimes, we classify regimes, and our argument is that these guys are now on the way to extinction. Now, they resist. They don't want to give up. They are not stepping down. But they, nonetheless, are a minority among non-democratic regimes. So, again, Putin 2.0. So basically, our argument is that Russian regime has moved from the new-style dictatorship to old-style dictatorship in the last few months. And we finished our book before the war has started, but already in the book, we argue that that may happen. And in that sense, we've been fortunate enough, actually, to identify data points which show that Putin's regime is on the wrong trajectory. But I'll talk more about that later. So basically, our argument is very simple. So modern dictatorships are different. They're the dictatorships that are better suited to today's world of open borders, global economy, new communications technology. This world is a home to a new breed of dictators, which manipulate information, which deceive rather than terrorize. And their goal is to project an image that I should be your leader, because if you choose somebody else, things will not be as fine. I don't terrorize you into submission, and I don't brainwash you into an ideology which is convincing you to give up your own interests. My narrative is support me, and I will provide you with a quality of life which is higher than the alternative. So this is a key chart that I want to show you. So what we do, we classify the regimes by the time period in which the dictators came to power. We only look at regimes which have at least 5 years in office to limit ourselves to a certain discipline and to exclude outliers. And then we draw some lines in the sense saying that if you kill more than so many people in a year, we believe that you're a brutal guy. If fewer, then not so brutal. We look at the concentration, we look at political prisoners, alleged use of torture, and criteria like this. And we generally classify the regimes. Some of the regimes we are not able to classify because we don't find data. You would be surprised to what extent data on repression is not comprehensive. And we built a data set which we call authoritarian control techniques, which is on the website, where we go regime by regime and collect data on torture, on political prisoners, on political killings, and so on. But the general picture is pretty much like this. If you look at the dictators who come to power in the second half of 20th century, the vast majority of them, the ones we are able to classify, are fear dictators, dictators that use terror. If you look at the last few decades, 80s, 90s, 2000s, then you end up with a flipping image where spin dictators suddenly take off. And basically, the average dictator today, the majority of dictators today are spin dictators. Very few are fair dictators, and the rest are hybrid regimes where classification is not precise. So I can show you many more graphs, but let me actually try to give you the main arguments first, and maybe if you have questions, I'll show you data on political prisoners, on political killings, on concentration of media market in the hands of government and its friends, and then probably if you have questions, I will go through those questions. Anyway, so our main argument is that the difference between the two is fear versus deception, being open about terrorizing others or being elusive about what your main argument should be. And in our evidence, we show that since 1980s, the number of authoritarian leaders who use mass repression, who hold political prisoners and kill people, and use torture has actually declined. What is much more important is whether violence is public or hidden. Basically, spin dictators say, well, this guy died of a sickness. It's not that I killed him or poisoned him, right? And when I put you in jail, I don't put you in jail because you're my political opponent, because you didn't pay taxes on time, right? So that's exactly the difference. And one of the guys who stayed in power long enough to start in the heyday of fear dictatorships and ended up in the era when that actually went out of fashion was Colonel Gaddafi, who famously said that when he was talking about other leaders who hide their violence, he said, we don't do that. If we execute somebody, we need to execute them on television. And basically that was his argument. You should have fear. I am brutal. Now, if you look at Putin 1.0, his key opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, was killed in front of Kremlin in 2015. The other key opposition leader was poisoned. In both cases, Vladimir Putin denied involvement. Now, we know for sure that Navalny was poisoned by Putin's hit squad. With Nemtsov, to this day, we don't actually have full information. But what he said, these are my enemies who killed Nemtsov. That was a provocation, right in front of the Kremlin with all the cameras somehow switched off. And yet, his idea was that that's not me. If you want to instill fear in the opposition, you do the opposite. You say, I kill this guy and I will kill everybody like him. And that's what Stalin would do. But Vladimir Putin is different. Now, how do they work with this limited and covert repression? So this is actually not trivial, and this is what the book is about. We trace the innovation process. We look at the pioneers of the system who design certain ways, and others copy, others develop. And since we talk so much about Putin today, Putin was not the first one. But he learned and developed many tools to perfection. So as I mentioned, it's a different way of treating your political opponents. And normally, what happens, instead of putting people in jail for 10 years, like Navalny is now in jail for 9 or 10 years, nobody is exactly sure how many, but that happened only now. Before that, Navalny would go to jail several times a year. So in total, he would spend 3 months a year in jail, but each time he would spend a week, couple of weeks, or months. So another Russian opposition leader, Ilya Yashin, who is now in jail and probably will spend many years in jail now, as long as Putin is in the Kremlin. In 2019, when he wanted to run for office, he was detained 5 times in a row. He would get a week in prison. He would walk out. A week later, he would be arrested again and sent for another week in prison. And each time, it was a small violation of an insignificant law. But he, nonetheless, was not able to run because he was not there in time to register his nomination. A similar example is a Kurdish politician, Nurettin Demirtas, who is a brother of current leader of Kurdish party. So In 2009, he was arrested not because he was a leader of an opposition party, but because he faked his medical certificate to avoid army service. And we in the book go through many such examples. Now, all these regimes hold elections. This is actually very interesting. We talk about how in most of these regimes, there are elections now, you have multi-party elections, and the ruling party doesn't get 95% of the vote. So this is becoming, those tools becoming obsolete. Instead, these regimes run elections, but these elections are manipulated. Like information, these regimes manipulate elections as well. And basically, this is one of the graphs where we count proportions of regimes which ban candidates outright or instead harass candidates, opposition candidates more often. And you see that there is an increase in recent years regarding this. Media bias is also very common when opposition candidates don't have access to media because media is controlled directly or indirectly through censorship or through cooptation of owners, right? So this is quite typical. So what are other differences? One is, as I mentioned, ideology. So the other one is different rhetoric. So one thing which we did, we looked at the speeches of democratic leaders and non-democratic leaders. And we compared speeches of non-democratic fear dictators and spin dictators, right? And so we counted words. And basically, not only spin dictators wear gray suits, they also speak like people who wear gray suits, democratic leaders. And basically, whatever way you slice it, fear dictators talk about fear, violence, war. Spin dictators talk about economics, public goods provision, inflation, unemployment, investment in human capital. So this diagram shows you the placement of dictators by percentage of words associated with violence and with competence. The red guys in rectangles, these are fear dictators. And they're low, they don't talk about economic performance. And they're to the right, they talk about violence. Now, if you look at spin dictators, here these are Lee Kuan Yew, Nazarbayev, Putin, Correa, and Chavez. They're to the left and upwards. And when you do statistical analysis, you actually can see that spin dictators are indistinguishable from Democrats in the content of their speeches, and both are significantly different from fear dictators. So basically, this is the overall list. The fear dictators rule through fear, spin dictators rule through deception. Fear dictators use mass repression, spin dictators use limited repression. Why? Because the more limited repression is, the easier it is to hide it and say, I don't have any repression, and I am a normal democratic leader. And then violence is publicized in old-style regimes and hidden, denied, concealed in new regimes. Now, interestingly, censorship works differently. Censorship in old regimes is public and comprehensive. In new regimes, it's actually, again, covert and deniable. If you look at the data, and we did look at the data, when you ask people, do you think media is free in your country? It turns out that in spin dictatorships, less educated people, there is actually a very important nuance that in our theory of these regimes, it's important to differentiate between educated people who understand what's going on and less educated people who are convinced by censorship and propaganda works differently as well. So in those data that we look at, less educated people in spin dictatorships think that media is free. Because the beauty of censorship is that you can censor the information about censorship itself. The recursivity of this is you don't know that journalists get harassed, killed, bribed. This is something that you cannot publish exactly because media is censored. And so in many non-free countries, you have this feature. In old-style dictatorships, nobody even tried to deny that there was censorship. In Soviet Union, there was a big department of censorship, Glavlit, with thousands of people working on it. And it was very clear that there is no entry for certain kinds of writers or playwrights. In modern Russian constitution, we proudly say censorship is illegal and forbidden. So this is exactly the approach. So the other thing is, of course, I already mentioned ideology, propaganda. So propaganda works very, very differently. Because there is no ideology, propaganda sends a very sophisticated message. And the goal of the narrative is not to say we have this beautiful ideology and everybody should submit to it, but it's just our leader is competent. He knows how to run the economy. He knows how to fight social problems. And maybe things are not great. Maybe incomes don't grow. But without our leader, they would actually grow even slower. And this narrative, as I mentioned, as I showed to you, this narrative is in terms of incomes, inflation, unemployment, like in a democratic society. And that's the whole idea. The whole idea is we are having the same debate as in democratic society. It just so happens that people who oppose our leader don't get hurt. So, and then the other issue is liberal and illiberal democracy. You know that Fareed Zakaria wrote a book about illiberal democracies, assuming that illiberal democracy is something like a non-democracy. Now these regimes are called electoral autocracies. But basically when he said that, it was a negatively connotated term. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, proudly says, we have a real democracy and it is a illiberal democracy. One of the most painful elements of my career in the BRD was a morning after Donald Trump won an election. We, all the leadership of the BRD, went to Budapest to be welcomed by Viktor Orbán in the palace of his party, where he hosted a conference on economic growth, of course, not on repression and censorship. Yet he welcomed us with the following message: welcome, my friends, to the new era of the West, when we finally can get rid of these falsehoods about political correctness and liberalism. And of course, one other thing, in old regimes, there was an exit visa. It was hard to leave. It was very little penetration of trade and investment. And now these regimes are actually created to encourage flows of people, ideas, and capital, exactly because they want economic performance, because this is something that is making them popular to their public. And economic performance is better if you use modern technology and bring foreign investors. And this is for that you need to put on a gray suit, because for foreign investors it's easier to talk to people in gray suits than in military uniforms. So why they change? Now, everything I said before is backed by data. Now, I will say a few things where we speculate. Now, if I just give you a descriptive piece of work, how modern dictatorships work, turns out that books don't sell, so you really need to be brave to speculate and say certain things which you cannot publish in academic journals. So we are pretty sure that we speculate correctly, but I'm open to accepting that these are the statements which are not really backed by data. They're backed by some anecdotal evidence, but not really by regressions. So our argument is, and here it is actually related to something that is discussed in a book by Francis Fukuyama or Lipset paper and book about modernization. We talk about modernization and globalization that make this breed of dictators more successful in current environment. So we talk about the way how, in order to grow your economy, you now need to employ educated people, creative people. You also need to trade and attract investment, because if not, you can remain at the level of North Korea, but that doesn't help you to be popular. And also, since information technology is so well developed right now, then people will know that South Korea lives better than North Korea if you allow some in information technology. It's very hard to create walls right now. And so you need to repress your own people if you keep the incomes at the industrial levels. If you want post-industrial levels, you need to be more open and you need to allow certain freedoms to the educated class. Now, modernization theory considers modernization as a prerequisite for sustainability of democracy. We don't fully agree with this statement. We qualify it by two elements, both of which are very, very important. One is that modernization is happening worldwide. Even if you have censorship in your own country, you still have CNN and you have YouTube. You can watch what is produced by CNN journalists at home through new media technology. You also have Amnesty International. You also have a very important argument, which is exactly the point of Fukuyama, the end of Cold War. So before the end of the Cold War, you may have a right-wing, anti-communist, brutal dictator. And the West would close its eyes on its allies against communism, because the Cold War was an existential battle. And after the end of the Cold War, the West suddenly realized that, well, we don't need brutal African or Latin American generals abusing human rights. And if Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch want to fight them, that's in our own benefit. And so today, you may still feel something like this. So you may think, well, US has certain non-democratic allies in the war on terror. You may even think about the war in Ukraine when the West needs to be an ally of certain regimes which are certainly non-democratic, such as Turkey, right? Still, this is completely different scale. In the time of Cold War, you had plenty of those regimes, and the world was divided in two. Now, the other thing is this thing, the last bullet point on this slide. Basically, spin dictatorship is a Darwinian evolution which makes you better fit for this modernized world. Yet it cannot last forever. Why? Because to grow your economy, you need to increase the number of educated people with tertiary education, with creative occupations, with knowledge-based production. And these people understand what's going on better and better and better. And we show with the data, this is something we show with the data, that in spin dictatorships, when you ask people with tertiary education and without, whether they like their government or not, whether they approve their government or not, in democracies, educated people are happier about their government, which is normal because you have a better deal in this world if you have a college degree. In this country. Well, this country is a bit of an exception because here you can do very well without college degree, with a vocational degree. But in most democratic countries, this is actually not the case. So in dictatorship, in spin dictatorships, it is the other way around. Educated people are very unhappy about the governments. Why? Because they understand that the country is actually going in the wrong direction. And this is interesting because educated people still have higher incomes, higher happiness, higher job satisfaction, but they have lower satisfaction with the government. And so the more unhappy people you have in the country, the more expensive it is to co-opt educated people into silence or censor them or repress them in a targeted way. And if you have too many educated people, suddenly your budget constraint becomes a problem because on one hand, you have to fill the fridges of less educated people. On the other hand, you need to pay the propagandists to convince them. Then you have to either co-opt the educated class, the educated strata, or use targeted repression against them. And so overall, if there are too many of those who want to speak out, you are in trouble. So our argument is that eventually, yes, modernization, globalization march forward, spin dictatorship model also becomes unsustainable, which may, by the way, result in something that we may not like. And basically, one scenario is that they democratize, and we give an example of Ecuador in the book, there is a recent example of Armenia, where spin dictatorship was actually replaced by democracy. But then some of these spin dictators actually go back. And this is something that we already discussed in the book. The prime example of spin dictatorship, which was not sustainable, instead of democratization, went back to 20th century repressive style. And this is, of course, Venezuela. Chavez was a typical spin dictator. Maduro is a typical fear dictator. And again, even visually, you can see that, even though Maduro is a bus driver, not a warrior, and Chavez was a commander, colonel of Marines, I think, and is wearing a civilian suit. So another example would be Erdogan, who initially was actually a populist, then spin dictator, then is pretty much, in our book, is classified as a fear dictator. And the other thing is, of course, Putin, which until recently was a spin dictator and then became a fear dictator. And this is the transformation I'm sure we will discuss a lot today. But just in a few words, we think that Putin didn't want to walk away from spin model. He wanted to replay a spin war, like in 2014. Annexation of Crimea is a typical spin dictator's war that is deniable, at least in the beginning, is not really bloody, and yet gives you popularity because people say, well, you're very competent. Well, maybe not really honest, you still learn from your neighbors, but at least you do it very, in a very smart and quick way. And the piece of evidence that I would give you that Putin wanted to do the same in 2022 is that he introduced censorship, he introduced mass repression, he started openly harass his political opponents for their political views. He closed down in Russia, he closed down Facebook and Instagram, but 1 week after the war has started, not before. And the first week of the war was crucial because a lot of people, including American military experts, at least publicly, said that Kyiv would fall within a few days. And once that didn't happen and the war became a long, protracted, bloody war, Putin understood that he needs to switch to a different model. And a week later, all independent media were closed. Facebook and Instagram were blocked. And there was a special law which says if you call this war a war and not a special military operation, you go to jail for several years. And there are already people who are in jail for 7 years just for saying things about this war. And so this transformation was extremely rapid. And this transformation is also interesting because it also shows you. So if you suddenly want to become a North Korea, how costly it is to you in economic terms. That shows you that it's better to trade and attract foreign investment than completely isolate yourself from the rest of the world. Because in this case, it's very hard to produce cars or tanks, for that matter. So this is, for us, we still kind of remain optimists. We think that fear dictatorships can also not last long, even though there are some counterexamples such as North Korea. But overall, we believe that if modernization and globalization march on, then eventually these regimes will fall. But again, this is definitely speculation. This is definitely speculation. And now you would ask me what we should do. Basically, our argument is you should not isolate those countries because you want to try to reach out to societies within, try to make sure that modernization within those societies continues, make sure that people within those societies are informed, and this is why we advocate engagement. But at the same time, this engagement should be adversarial in the sense that you should recognize that these people are dictators. You should not say that, well, I will look the other way because you wear a gray suit. No, you open a textbook, the definition of dictatorship is a non-democracy. Democracy is where leaders and policies are chosen through free and fair elections. You look at the elections in Turkey, Russia, Kazakhstan, and you say, sorry, This is not a democracy. This is just a factual statement, nothing personal. Now, the other thing is, of course, put your own house in order. Every crisis in the West feeds the narrative of spin dictators. Spin dictators thrive on problems of democracies. They say, you tell me that we are corrupt, but look, how many senators in the US are insider traders? Huh? You are talking to me. Look at your friends in Washington, D.C. And all of that is feeding the narrative, and that's exactly why reform at home is not just important for home, but it's also important for removing the arguments from those dictators in those countries. An interesting dimension of that is international institutions. These dictators wearing gray suits are very successful in penetrating international institutions. The fundamentals of our law-based international order. I already mentioned Orbán talking to EBRD management, but of course we also saw the role of Orbán in the EU when we discussed sanctions. We also saw the role of Turkey in NATO when Sweden and Finland wanted to join. I should remind you that China is a member of Interpol, so that should scare a lot of people. And occasionally China wants to put their own Director General of Interpol in charge of this organization. So this is something to think about, and we're very happy that Joe Biden initially started with this agenda with his Forum of Democracy. And finally, think about those narratives. Think about how you promote democracy without creating a narrative for dictators. So try to choose your means, because once you start saying the end justifies the means, that also helps those guys with the narrative. So let me conclude because I'm running out of time. So basically, the empirical observation is spin dictatorships are now more common than fear dictatorships. They use information manipulation. They deceive rather than terrorize. And they pretend to be Democrats. And that is actually not a non-trivial reason for being optimistic, because they don't have an alternative model. They try to borrow our model, because our model is actually popular. Whatever we think about popularity of democracy around the world, the very fact that majority of non-democratic leaders want to be seen as democratic suggests that people around the world like democracy. We also show data from around the world where we show that in general people like democracy, even though now, as Joachim said correctly, a lot more people would like to see the strong leader. But still, democracy is popular. And then they speak differently. Now, once again, these are the people who are better suited, better evolved for today's world. And finally, before concluding, I would say that overall, these trends of modernization, globalization, probably make the spin also unsustainable. And then the big question is, can we protect ourselves what we saw in Venezuela, Turkey, and Russia, and many other countries, I'm sure will go through that, where dictators trying to hold to their power would use the old model at a huge cost to their country. I mentioned Putin's economic misadventures, but of course Venezuela is a story where GDP went down by about a factor of 4 or 5, 20% of population left the country, and those who stayed lost about 10 kilos of weight because of lack of food and rationing. And of course inflation in Turkey also should be a part of any macroeconomic textbooks of how you shouldn't do things. So let me stop here. Thank you for your attention, and remind you that this is a wonderful book with a great title and a great cover.
All right, well, thank you for this wonderful talk. We have quite a few questions from the audience. Let me try to ask you the first one. So I understand the difference between spin dictators on the one hand and fear dictators on the other. The thing I'm not so fully convinced by is that this is something new. So let's think about where you currently are working, Paris, and somebody you might have heard of called Napoleon, who staged 2 referenda, which confirmed him first as dictator and then as emperor of the French Empire. And clearly he saw some benefit in sort of having this show of public support. I think he scored a 99.9% rate of support. And all of this in the days before Twitter and Facebook or anything else. So isn't it always cheaper to just pretend that everybody's on your side? And there's really nothing new except that this waxes and wanes over time.
Thank you. It's a great question. And in France, we actually like the example of Napoleon III, who initially was democratically elected leader and then became an emperor, ruled the country through less democratic means. And that is something that we see in the 21st century a lot. But you're right, of course, if you can win a vote, it's great under any condition, and many today's dictators initially won the vote because they had some initial legitimacy. So we also talk about why some dictators last in office longer than others. Some of them are just lucky in the sense that they come to power at opportune moment when democracy is growing, and they honestly win elections, and they love this. And then they have this credibility boost. People see, this is a competent guy, but this may be just a lucky guy. If you're a competent guy, though, you don't need to spend so much more money on censorship and propaganda, and people like you even more. So if you're just lucky enough in the beginning of your career, that may give you more chances to stay longer. And then, at some point, you discover that maybe you cannot win an honest election, like it happened to people I was talking about, such as Erdogan and Putin. And then you may turn to imperial ways, let's put it this way. So there is nothing new that you want to win a fair election that you can. The problem with most dictators is that at some point they stop being able to win those elections. And the question is, if you go Napoleon way and become an emperor with an army, or you go Orbán way and buy media, pack courts, organize elections according to European rules, and until very recently get 3% of GDP from Brussels as subsidies. And exactly because you wear a gray suit, right? And don't call yourself emperor. And this is exactly the distinction. So whether you use force openly or you use other subtle tools. We actually, in the book, we even go to Aristotle. So it's not Napoleon. It's actually even older than that, who talks about tyrants. You know, Aristotle has a matrix of political regimes. It's a 2x3 matrix. 3 rows are if one person's running the show, a few people run the show, or a lot of people run the show. And if it's one person, I think it's king versus tyrant. A few people, it's nobility versus oligarchy. And many people, democracy versus polity. Democracy is actually something that we would call today achlocracy. So a lot of uneducated people run the show, run the country into the ground, right? But for each of those roles, he has 2 elements, good guys and bad guys. And so tyrant is a bad dictator. But then he says that some dictators are not actually using those weird, barbaric Persian arts. Tools of repression for him are Persian arts. And he actually hints that that may work. So you also see this discussion in Machiavelli, but Machiavelli actually says fear is better than love.
Great. So let me just pick some questions from the Menti list. So you emphasize the importance of media. And many of the media types and examples you gave seem a little bit old style. So Do you have any thoughts on the effect of new forms of media, peer-to-peer communication? Is it more on the side of sort of creating fragility for the spin dictators because information can flow across borders? Or is it the opposite, where you can monitor and receive granular information and target it and actually make spin dictatorships more effective?
So this is a great question, and I think whatever I say today may be wrong tomorrow, because this thing is evolving. And one example we discuss in the book is China, which we neither classify as a spin dictatorship or a traditional fear dictatorship, because it's an evolved fear dictatorship. It's a digital fear dictatorship that uses modern technology, including social media, for controlling opposition. There is no opposition exactly because of that. China is a very open fear dictatorship. You can have confessions of dissidents on TV, something you would see in Stalin's Soviet Union. But if we move to spin dictatorships, the situation becomes more complex. And actually, once you start asking this question, you try to ask, to what extent spin dictatorships fear or use social media? And the answer is they are more likely to fear social media and block them. And you know, Erdogan blocked a lot of social media already 10 years ago. Putin has done as well. Putin, I mentioned Navalny. Navalny was a nemesis of Putin in recent years exactly because his YouTube channel started to rival national TV. And this is what, to a great extent, contributed to the fall of popularity of Putin, which Putin could not accept. And so this, I think, resulted in poisoning of Alexei Navalny. However, there are new tools. And new tools, these are those internet research agency, the famous Prigozhin trolls, troll factories, and so on. And so these regimes always experiment. They learn from each other. They try to use new media. They try to target the opposition with online attacks. They try to do it in a sophisticated way. So we now know from insiders of troll factories that initially those factories would recruit people in trios. So these people would come to work at 9 o'clock. They go to internet forum of Vladivostok, because that's where the time is already, the sun is already up. So they say, we need to discuss those issues. And among three people, one says, Putin is great. The second one says, no, Putin is horrible. And the third one says, no, you're both wrong. The truth is in the middle. Putin is good. And this simulation of the debate is exactly this innovation, how you use new media, pretend to have a debate, try to convince through this facade, Potemkin debate, right? So that is something that is. Now, but let me give you one piece of quantitative evidence. So Dan and I wrote this paper where we looked at popularity of authoritarian leaders around the world, about 50 regimes, a panel of countries from Gallup World Polls. And basically, we tried to quantify what would have happened if Putin didn't have internet censorship. And I should tell you that before the war, China is, of course, a different universe. But Russia and Turkey were leading the pack in terms of internet censorship, number of blocked websites and stuff. And so if you remove internet censorship from Putin, he loses pretty much 30 percentage points of his popularity. He goes down from 70 to 35, something like this, or to 40. So that is a major pillar. So, somehow using internet censorship is a major pillar of his popularity, of his stability.
Great, thanks. So let's open this up to the floor. Any questions from the audience? Okay, back here.
Thank you. My name is Hani Selim. I'm Swiss Egyptian. And Mr. Guriev, thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. My question concerns Ukraine, if I can ask a question about Ukraine. In a recent panel event hosted by the International Studies Association that included eminent American political scientists like Stephen Walt from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, Barry Paulson from MIT, and John Mearsheimer from University of Chicago. Here is what John Mearsheimer said about the US leading Ukraine war efforts against Russia. Quote, "We are in this war. We are leading. The big question Europeans want to ask themselves is this: How happy are you following the United States? When I look at American foreign policy leadership, it makes me nervous. In fact, I have a big knock in my stomach. I don't have the sense that people who run American foreign policy are first-rate strategists. I'm not even sure they are second-rate strategists, to be honest. It's very scary to see those boys and girls in operation. And you, Europeans, you want to think long and hard about what you got yourself into. Think about what you're wishing for here, because there are big troubles coming. The consequences of this Ukraine fiasco cannot be underestimated. They are going to be wide and they are going to be deep. And in my opinion, it is the Americans who are principally responsible for creating this mess, end quote. So, Mr. Guriev, what is America's end game in Iraq? I mean, in Ukraine. Where will we reach this end game? In 2 years, 5 years? And finally, while Europeans are trying to enjoy the Biden administration right to reach an end game, can you assure us today that Europe will not be economically, socially, and politically destroyed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a big question. I didn't fully understand what. So you want me to project the future, to predict the future, and whether Europe will be destroyed. So I'm not sure I'm in a position to give a forecast like this. But I can give you a historical parallel, which is, in 2014, all the foreign policy establishment was discussing. We are now commemorating 1914, 100 years from 1914, and 75 years from 1939. So are we, in 2014, replaying 1914 or 1939? Is appeasement a good idea, or is walking into the war is a good idea? Sleepwalking into the war. And I think 2014 was a bit like 1938. Yes, I think it was an attempt in appeasement, which failed by now. And I think now we live in 39, 41, or maybe 42, because occasionally you hear genocidal statements on Russian TV that Ukrainians don't deserve to be a nation. And Mr. Putin occasionally uses terms like, forgive me for my German, Nationalvertreter, national traitors. And he says things like, final solution. We need a final solution to this question. And this is something that is already not 39, but 42. And I think these are the images current foreign policy elite in Europe has in mind. Now, quality of strategies in the White House, in Brussels, in Berlin, I think, again, not for me to evaluate. Overall, I would remind you that we live in a very difficult time for democratic political leaders. Democratic political leaders need to be competent to deliver on expectations of the voters. On the other hand, they cannot be too far from a normal person, because otherwise they will not represent them, right? So try to triangulate this challenge. Either you have a college degree, then you're unlike majority of Americans who don't. But if you don't have a college degree, it's very hard to be an effective leader in American Congress, where everybody has a college degree, right? So all these challenges are real. Democratic societies suffer, but honestly, I don't see an alternative to what Europe and America are doing now. Will America and Europe be worse off because of this war? Sure. Will China be worse off because of this war? Sure. Today, the forecast of global GDP for 2022 is $1 trillion lower than pre-war forecast. $1 trillion is 3 years of global international development aid. With this money, we could have solved the global extreme poverty problem today. So all of this destruction is bad for everybody, of course. But in counterfactual ways, what else can you do? You let Putin annex Ukraine, will he stop? Did Finns and Swedes thought? So Mearsheimer is in Chicago, right, I think. But Stockholm and Helsinki suddenly realized that Lviv is farther away from St. Petersburg than Helsinki and Sweden. And they suddenly stop being neutral and join NATO. And so for them, this calculus was very, very clear. And I think these people know their strategy very well, because for them, like for Baltic states and Poland, it's an issue of survival. So I think this discussion is too theoretical when you hold it in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and much more strategic and pragmatic when you talk about that close to Russia.
Excellent. We have one more question over here.
Yes, my name is Jörg. Your presentation focused on the description and the typology of dictatorships, and then you jumped into responses to it. So I missed actually two things. First, what is the dictator? I mean, this is it's not just a singular person hitting on the table. It's an entourage, and they are players and interest groups, and maybe the person you presented are not the relevant ones, but what is behind the scene. And the second question is, what about the motives? It's like a trial where you punish the person, but don't discuss what was the motives of what happened. So I miss completely the discussion about the trial, because otherwise the responses are not effective if we don't look at the players and the motives.
Right. It's a great question. So first and foremost, what is a dictator? You know, Anna Karenina opens with this famous statement that all happy families are happy in a similar way, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways. And basically, dictators can be different. There are military dictatorships, religious dictatorships, monarchies, party dictatorships, personalistic dictatorships, but they're all similar in one way. They're non-democracies. And all democracies are similar. If you open a textbook in political science, they say democracy is where you select leaders and policies through free and fair elections in which the vast majority of population participates. So this is basically the definition. Then, of course, you can say free and fair. How do you quantify this? And that's why, for example, some people would agree with Joachim that today we have onset of new dictatorial era, and majority of humanity is now living in non-democracies. And some people would disagree and would say India is still a democracy. So majority of population of the world lives in democracies. So there is a disagreement where to draw a line free and fair, competitive, and so on. But overall, this is the definition. Either you have the choice of how the country is governed by the people or by somebody else. And it could be God directly, could be inherited monarchy, and so on. Now, most of these regimes are actually personalistic. And it's not a coincidence I was showing you pictures of men. They're all men, by the way. Because if you have a religious dictatorship, it's likely to be ideological. If it's a monarchy, it's very hard to pretend you're a democracy if you're a non-constitutional monarchy, right? If you're a military junta, very hard to pretend that you use spin rather than fear. And so these regimes usually pretend to be personalistic. They're not all presidential regimes. Lee Kuan Yew was a prime minister. Today, Singapore is still a parliamentary republic, also not a democracy. Orbán's Hungary is a parliamentary democracy. Orbán is a prime minister. So, but yet, these are mostly personalistic regimes. So what is wrong with them? Why do we need responses to them? I guess this is what your question is. And I'm sorry, I skipped all of that because I only had 40 minutes, and so I wanted to concentrate on certain things. What is wrong with non-democracies? Well, non-democracies are not delivering on economic growth. There is a long debate that what causes what, whether democracy causes growth or growth causes democracy. Probably the causal links go both ways, but there is a recent paper by Acemoglu and co-authors, Acemoglu, Naidu, Recep, and Robinson, which says democratization does cause growth. And this is a pretty convincing paper. There is still a debate, but basically if one country moves from non-democracy to democracy, it gains 1 percentage point of GDP growth for the next 20 or 30 years. That's much, too little, not sure. But in the world where we have so many challenges to fight, every additional percentage point of GDP is actually good for solving climate and poverty issues. So the other issue is these guys undermine Western democratic institutions as well. So these regimes are mostly corrupt. So Lee Kuan Yew was quite an exception. So these regimes are mostly corrupt. Why? Because they need to pretend to be democracies, but they're not. So they need to co-opt elites, but in a way which looks like something legal. So you need your minister to support you through and through, because the minister needs to know that he is going to have a huge palace, which we'll never have under democracy. So you pay this minister a normal democratic salary, and then you give him an envelope full of cash, so he can build a palace and defend you. Right? So these cooptation processes are always non-transparent. And this non-transparency and corruption gets exported to the West through enablers, through lobbyists, lawyers, PR consultants, investment bankers. Why? Because these guys love exporting corruption. If corruption is hidden, that enablers help them to get what they want in terms of foreign policy. If the corruption is disclosed, these guys say, see, the West is also corrupt. And in that sense, it's a win-win proposition for them to export corruption, and that's what they do full-time. And in that sense, if you care about quality of Western democratic institutions, you should think about those regimes. These are dangerous regimes. These are not just nice people who sit on their island and never do anything bad to anybody else. They undermine their own economic performance, and they export bad stuff to good countries.
Great. Let me take one final question from the Menti questions submitted. So you characterized Russia and the Putin 1.0 spin dictatorship as latently fragile, a sign of people not necessarily being behind the dictator, needing to be lied to and sold a story of economic riches and competence. And that particular interpretation makes it much harder to understand how you end up in the current situation, starting a war that has real economic consequences, may even put into question the beloved European vacations of the Russian elite, isolates Russia and puts many question marks behind the stability of the regime. So how does this actually help us rationalize and understand where we are now?
So thanks. Not everything I know about dictatorships is in this book. So let me refer to another paper of mine with Konstantin Sonin and Sergei Guriev, as well as by a recent paper of my co-author Daniel Treisman, who argues that dictators make mistakes quite often. He actually tracks the decisions of dictators, and he shows that a lot of dictatorial regimes bring their own collapse themselves by making a mistake. And our paper, which was published in 2009, explains you why some dictators actually choose partially free media and some actually choose unfree media. Why? Because, well, free media, even partially free media, help the opposition to coordinate against you. And so it's dangerous. But partially free media also provide you feedback. They tell you when your bureaucrats steal, are incompetent, do things wrongly, and therefore create conditions for the change of the regime. And so dictators benefit from partially free media because they get feedback. But if they go too far in censorship, they may end up with a situation where they're just making mistakes. And I think Putin underestimated Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people and Ukrainian president who didn't run away, because people around him told him they will run away and they will welcome us. And nobody could stand up and say something different to Putin because Putin suppressed critical debate in the country. And then he underestimated unity of the West and resolve of the West, and that may be driven by the disorderly exit from Afghanistan half a year before. So that was a major contributor, I believe. And then he overestimated his own army, which, as we now know, has been badly managed, corrupt, underfunded, and being in Switzerland, close to Paradeplatz, I can say that maybe some of the money Putin spent on the army ended up in foreign banks. So he made all these mistakes, but his idea was to continue with spin dictatorship, as I mentioned. He wanted a much simpler 2014 style war. he didn't want to introduce North Korea, but now he has no choice. And this is very sad, but I think my prediction, there was a question about prediction, is that at some point the front line will stop moving either direction. And we'll have something like a Korean War. You know that Korean War is still going on. You know that there is no peace agreement between North Korea and South Korea. And so we may end up with the same situation. Where this front line will be, where this DMZ between Russia and Ukraine will be, I don't know. I'm not a military expert now, like I was not a COVID expert 2 years ago. But after that, Putin will be under sanctions, and so Russia will be one large Iran. Ukraine will start reconstruction. And I can advertise a paper we wrote with some Western and Ukrainian economists called Blueprint for Reconstruction of Ukraine, where we actually talk about Marshall Plan for Ukraine after the war. I'm sure this reconstruction will be difficult because Putin will keep sending rockets to destroy what's being built. And that's going to be a very tragic trajectory. But actually, the fact that Ukraine now has a membership trajectory, candidate status, will facilitate things a lot. And I'm actually quite optimistic. I think after the war ends, and again, I don't know when it ends, I think 10 years later, Ukraine will join the European Union.
All right, Sergei, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
This was a wonderfully inspiring and thought-provoking lecture, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope to welcome you again on October 5th. We're going to host a webcast with Steve Sikala on the economics of the ongoing energy crisis in Europe. And then on November 7th, we invite you to the anniversary edition of our flagship event, the Forum for Economic Dialogue, where we focus on the questions relating to superstar firms and their impact on society. Joachim Almunia, the Vice President of the European Commission and Commissioner in charge of competition policy, is going to be the keynote speaker together with Eric Posner, who is a counsel for the Department of the Justice Antitrust Division in the US. And you can also check us out on YouTube and our channel to ruthlessly spin our own social media impact. Thank you.
Thank you.